Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our risk-based vendor due diligence on vendors, identifying scope, scale, and documents webinar. My name is Abby Clark, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right-hand corner of that widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you offline via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed as well in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Jill Sherman, VendMinder's third-party risk principal. She will discuss how to conduct risk-based due diligence on your vendors. You'll also see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our due diligence checklist for low, moderate, and high-risk vendors, our ways to improve vendor document collection efficiency infographic, and our What to Do with Vendor Due Diligence Information ebook, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the related content widget. So with that being said, I would like to hand it over to Jill. Jill, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks, Abby, for the introduction. I'm pretty excited about this presentation because we get questions around this topic all the time. We often talk about the overall steps in vendor risk process. We talk about the different types of information that needs to be collected as part of due diligence, but a lot of times it stops there. We don't have many practical conversations about what exactly we need to do for a particular vendor based on what they're doing for us. This is the part of TPRM that gets complex, subjective, and often the trickiest part of implementing a vendor management program. And that's particularly why Erin is joining us today, because there can often be more than one way to look at these things, so we want to provide some of that discourse. Our main goal for today is to give you some insight into what risk-based due diligence can look like, and maybe shed some light on how you might want to go about it at your organization, or share some food for thought to bring back to your existing program, and maybe add some grease to the wheel. Taking a quick look at our agenda, we'll start with an overview of the third-party risk lifecycle and the main components of a risk assessment, so that we can set the stage for then discussing a couple of different ways to conduct due diligence-based risk. Then we'll dive into some detail on what due diligence to conduct on specific inherent risks. And after that, we'll talk a little about the pros and cons of the methods we discussed, and then, of course, tips and best practices. Slide 4 of the presentation explains what vendor due diligence is. It is one of the most important activities in third-party risk management. It's conducted for new engagements and periodically for existing engagements. It comprises the collection, review, and assessment of applicable vendor information and controls, and it helps determine residual risk of your vendor. Slide number 5 asks, why do I need to do vendor due diligence collection? Well, here are 3 reasons why due diligence is completed on vendors. The first one, it's a regulatory expectation. Along with risk assessment, ongoing monitoring, contract management, and reporting, due diligence is a fundamental requirement of regulatory guidance. Below you'll see a bulleted list of regulatory guidance. The second reason for performing vendor document collection is that it makes good business sense. It helps protect your organization and also protects your customers and their data. It allows you to make an educated business decision, for example, whether this is a no-go with a new vendor or justification for exiting an existing vendor relationship. And third, you may find risky areas of the vendor relationship and have the opportunity to fix them. Due diligence is more than a checklist activity. This is an important point, so let me repeat that. Due diligence is more than a checklist activity. So it's important that we resist the temptation to have this mentality. It also identifies any gaps of weakness in a vendor's controls. Types of vendor due diligence. Initial due diligence is performed prior to entering a contractual agreement with the vendor. It's important to analyze the vendor and identify any risk that will be exposed to your organization. Initial due diligence also helps determine if the vendor will meet your strategic and financial goals. Ongoing due diligence, on the other hand, shows if a vendor's risk and performance changes over time, and it's critical to perform due diligence even after you've signed the contract. The frequency of ongoing due diligence will depend on the vendor's inherent risk level and criticality, but this is an important process that should apply to every vendor. We are approaching these next three slides like this. Here's a baseline of documents to collect, and here's where I'm switching now from discussing just low and high risk to now bringing in low, moderate, and high risk. So we'll start with the baseline, add on some for medium risk vendors, and then the final touch for high risk vendors. We consider this list the foundational documents. These are the documents you want to obtain or the checks you want to do in an initial vetting of that vendor. Make sure that they are a legitimate business, are actually in good standing in their state of record, do a news search to find any reputational concerns, actually go to Google Maps and see if their address is actually a building and not a vacant lot. There are several outsourced solutions out there that do many of these approaches, such as Argos Risk, for instance. We happen to partner with them. This is a great solution that can provide the bulk of this foundational information in a very cost-effective way. But if an outsourced solution is not possible, much of this is public record and just requires someone to surf the web. Of course, some of these actual documents you would need to request from the vendor. So for all of your vendors, regardless of criticality or risk, you should be doing much, if not at all, of what is listed on the slide. Let's look at moderate risk now, which is on the next page. Common document collection items to collect. All of the items in the previous list on slide number 8, they're the foundational or baseline due diligence that is still requested and reviewed. But for medium risk vendors, let's add in a few things, such as financials. These are not considered foundational. You can get a quick status of their payment history from Dun & Bradstreet or some other source, but once you move up the line in risk level, a financial review becomes far more important. At this level, you will also want to request insurance certificates, SOC reports, and other possible audit documents, the vendor's third-party risk management policy or program, and especially their information security policy. Remember, they now have a greater risk to your organization, so digging deeper into their controls, including their hiring practices, is extremely important since you are entrusting this vendor with your clients' and employees' information. At last, we've reached the high-risk vendor collection list on slide number 10. And of course, we've collected everything from the foundational documents to the items on the moderate risk list. So what else could there possibly be? You can see a thorough list on this slide. The emphasis is now placed on data access and handling practices, privacy practices, both application and network penetration testing results, actual results of disaster recovery tests, and you might even conduct an on-site visit. Even an on-site visit that is done remotely, as most are being done that way still these days, is a critical due diligence step for your high-risk rated vendors, those who have access to the most critical of all information. I want to make sure here that I don't mislead anyone to thinking that a high-risk vendor is a bad vendor. That is not the case. It's simply not true. In fact, you probably can't operate efficiently without your high-risk rated vendors. They perform critical functions for your company that allows you to provide the products and services for you to do for your customers. It's just extremely important that you have properly identified your high-risk rated vendors and that you properly perform due diligence and conduct oversight in a routine fashion. Now, another important thing to understand is the risk assessment process and how residual risk is determined. The first two green and blue steps in our wheel encompass an entire risk assessment. Remember that inherent risk is the amount of risk to your organization solely based on the nature of services and what they're doing for you. We recommend that you understand what this risk is before reaching out to the vendor to provide documents and information. The folks internally that brought on the business or who work with the vendor regularly should be able to tell you everything you need to know to make this determination. You should probably even be able to have a solid understanding of inherent risk just by reading the contract. Good idea to keep this in mind when drafting the contract. Anyway, when we subsequently do some research, collect and review information from the vendor, make sure internal measures are in place to reduce the risk a vendor poses. Then all that information we collect, anything that adds protection against something going wrong, becomes that with which we consider a control or a mitigating factor. Then at the end of an assessment, we decide what the remaining risk is and we rate it. This residual risk. And remember, throughout the whole process in our presentation, the best solution is always what works best for your organization, culture, and resources. A policy or process is only as good as its implementation. Try to build a machine that works consistently for you, making tweaks and improvements along the way as best you can. So, of course, if we're going to keep talking about inherent risk, we may as well go over some examples. Now, this list is by no means all-encompassing of all the inherent risks a vendor could pose to your organization. They'll certainly vary from industry to industry, especially those that fall under stringent regulations. But I'd still argue that this is a pretty solid list regardless. In my opinion, with inherent risk assessments, less is more. Save the stringent details for your due diligence and residual risk. You want this process to be fairly simple so that you can get the ball rolling on everything else you have to do. I'll give you a minute to look over these categories and the associated questions you might want to ask. We'll be going over most of these in some more detail, pretty much everything but the credit and transactional risk, because those can get into some specific considerations, and I want to really stick with pretty much what applies to all industries and not exclude anyone. Another one we're not going to dive into is strategic risk, mostly because this has to be determined by your organization's internal appetite and corporate strategies. What you would want to do is to mitigate strategic risk will probably look different from place to place, with the exception of, well, getting approvals from the top. Here's an overview of things you'll want to ask for from your vendors. Now, the term due diligence is used pretty loosely. You could say that performing due diligence is the entire risk assessment process we discussed earlier. In fact, a vendor risk assessment and due diligence assessment can sometimes be used interchangeably. Due diligence items, however, might refer to the specific information and documents that you collect from your vendor, like you see here. On the left would be your baseline. You need to know these things about your vendor so that you can do your research no matter what they're doing for you. You want to make sure you're not partnering with an organization that's up to no good. Then, of course, the real meat and potatoes of due diligence comes when there is any elevated risk or impact to your business operations. With that, you'll want to collect information more like what you see on the right, like policies, procedures, financials, SOC or other audit reports, business continuity, disaster recovery or information gathering questionnaires. Again, this is not all-inclusive. Just want to give you some examples of what we're going to be talking about. And just a side note on collecting information from your vendor. Make sure you keep a good database of vendor information, which provides insight into the types of services they offer, who owns those relationships within your organization, and also who the points of contact are on the vendor side. The more complex the service, the more points of contacts you should have. These actions listed on slide 14 should always be done, especially take note where there are elevated risks. Additionally, you have to take all that information that you compile, like surfing the web for negative info, checking the OFAC list, maybe even using a subscription service that does all these for you in furtherance of this due diligence effort. Something which is not listed in the slide but is important to note, make sure your internal controls are reviewed and handled by someone, including material contract terms, SLA tracking, and information security considerations, to name a few. This is an undertaking that will really vary from place to place depending on how your internal organization is structured and who has been assigned some of these delegated responsibilities. But it's important. As for the due diligence review, once all data is returned by the vendor that you requested, you have to review it. Whether it's a single TPRM guru that can validate all the controls themselves, or whether you must circulate the information that you retrieved across a group of subject matter experts, make sure to review the documentation that pertains to your organization. Next, residual risk can be determined. If you want to have a mature third-party risk management due diligence process which scales your efforts based on risk, there are two primary ways you can go about doing it. The first is the inherent risk ratings, like whether they're low, moderate, high, and or critical, or the individual risk factors that apply to the engagement. Quick recap, we determine the inherent risk rating by gathering information on what the vendor is doing for us. It's based on our perspective. Also, note that risk ratings drive due diligence collection and cadence. Here is what it might look like to determine due diligence based on risk ratings. We've bucketed which elements or control areas we need to validate by the inherent risk ratings. In speaking with clients, it's important to consider right-sizing the amount of due diligence work to perform the right amount of due diligence for your organizations based on your current abilities. A policy or process is only as good as its implementation. Don't set yourself up to fail immediately. As we've mentioned and will be expanding on shortly, there are a lot of data points to review on vendors, especially the higher risk and critical ones. You need to right-size your requests according to your internal abilities. Maybe you don't have a technical resource with availability on staff to review a vendor's technical control responses, or evidence you haven't outsourced that yet to a third-party risk management provider. In cases like these, you probably shouldn't be sending out a 300-question questionnaire on technical controls as you don't have anyone to appropriately process that information. Document and perform what you can do and look for ways your organization can improve the process going forward. When looking to improve, discuss whether your executive team and board are okay with limited qualified insight into your vendor's environment, who supports your organizations, and whether they see the need to mitigate the risk further by involving additional qualified people. All of that said, it will also depend on your compliance environment. If you're regulated and examined like financial institutions, for example, your requirements are going to be more rigorous and defined and receive closer inspection. And your right size is going to be different than for non-regulated entities.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we'll be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. And this poll question is, does your organization perform risk assessment and due diligence processes as part of your vendor management program? Yes, no, somewhat, not sure. And Jill, it looks like right now we have some time to answer one of the questions that have come in so far from the audience. And that question is, Can you explain the difference between inherent risk and residual risk again?
Thank you so much for the question. It's a great one. So inherent risk in risk management is an assessed level of raw or untreated risk. That is the natural level of risk inherent in a process or activity without doing anything to reduce the likelihood or mitigate the severity of a mishap or the amount of risk before the application of risk effects to reduce those effects due to controls. Residual risk, on the other hand, is defined as the threat that remains after every effort has been made to identify and eliminate risks in a given situation. In other words, it's the degree of exposure to a potential hazard even after that hazard has been identified and agreed upon mitigation has been implemented.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are those results. And by the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or a heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Also, before we move on, as a reminder, in the related content widget, you'll find our due diligence checklist for low, moderate, and high-risk vendors. That is a handy resource and lists out what you should be collecting from your vendors based on their risk level. With that, Jill, I'll hand it back to you.
Now here's the fun part. We're going to dive into 6 different inherent risk factors and review not only the control areas or subjects you'll want to validate, as seen in the slide on the left-hand side, but the actual documents you should ask to validate for those subjects, areas, or controls. But what happens when a vendor sends you documentation which does not cover what you thought it would? That's the reason it's so important to review the documents you gather for validating controls. Quality is very important, not just a check the box exercise in collecting vendor documents. You're looking at the documents to validate what's in them. Do not hesitate to circle back with the vendor if you need more info. If you receive documentation that does not cover what you thought it would, make sure you go back to the vendor and ask for more information. So what do we need to validate if a vendor will actually be hosting on their network your sensitive information? This can be scaled according to the sensitivity of that data, but for the most part, let's assume we're talking about highly sensitive or customer information. This, I would have to say, and Aaron, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the circumstance where inherent risk warrants the most amount of due diligence. You'll pretty much want to ask for everything. Go over to their place and check the tires to validate. They're literally got a fortress of controls around your data. Vendors who are storing and processing confidential data, especially consumer personally identifiable information, known as PII, should have their tires thoroughly checked. Let's just go over a few of the due diligence items and expand a bit on what to look for. To start at the top, the certifications which are the most common we see are ISO 27001, PCI DSS, and HITRUST. Unfortunately, with these certs, typically only a certification letter for ISO 27001 and HITRUST or an attestation of compliance report for PCI DSS are shared. That's one disadvantage of those standards versus SOC reports when performing due diligence. Not to say any of these aren't great certifications when applicable, as they're great achievements for vendors and do demonstrate a higher maturity control environment. Regarding policies and procedures, you really can get a mixed bag of responses from vendors as every company does things differently. Some vendors are open and provide a number of their governing documents without issue, while others provide governance overview documents. Yet, still, other vendors try to get by with only providing a table of contents or simply stating their documents are confidential. My opinion is that a table of contents are not sufficient. Vendor vetting is prevalent enough in the industry that organizations should be prepared to provide more than a table of contents. Some governing documents may contain business confidential information, which is understandable, so that is where summary or overview documents can be utilized. For SOC audit reports, a few things to keep in mind. There are differences between SOC 1s, 2s, and 3s. The difference between SOC 1s and Type 2s, as well as opinion types, are that the vendors write the controls, so not every SOC is the same. Just a heads up, we have 4 or so webinars a year just about SOC reports, so you can find a recording on our website, or there will be one coming up in the next few months if you'd like to learn more about SOC reports. Turning your attention to slide 19, what happens if the vendor has access to your data, but the vendor isn't hosting the data specifically? As you can see here, we've crossed out a number of items that might not apply, such as system and network security. Remember, this is their network we're talking about. Cloud and cybersecurity, physical security, financials in this case might not apply. And note in the instant example, you probably won't get a very happy vendor response if you request for their vulnerability scans and penetration test results. If this vendor is also critical, you may add some of these items back into your request, but we'll get to that shortly. In this vendor scenario, where the vendor is only accessing but not storing information, I seek to get a better understanding of some key items, such as authentication and user management, how the vendor is accessing the information and who's managing that access. Are you managing vendor access? Meaning, must the vendor notify your organization when one of their employees should no longer have access due to a role change or separation from the company? If so, there is a risk that perhaps a scorned prior employee may log into your environment and perform harmful actions against your data before you're notified, but they should no longer be able to access. Or you may receive an audit finding after an auditor reviews access against the principle of least privilege, as the vendor may not update access as appropriately due to a role change. A few more things to consider. You'll want to look into their security and privacy training to see whether it's sufficient for the level of access they have to your data. When your vendor is accessing sensitive information, you'll want to inquire about whether their employees are acting securely by not reusing passwords or using poorly constructed passwords. You'll also want to make sure that their employees are not copying any data from your system to their workstation, and whether or not the vendor is performing background checks when it's appropriate, when it relates to the type of data and processing being performed. Turning our attention to the instance when a vendor directly interacts with your customers or clients. Now remember, we're attacking each of these inherent risks individually, assuming that this is the only risk presented. Sometimes you could encounter, albeit not often, a vendor who uses your network or phone system to interact with your customers, and so vetting their internal systems is not quite applicable. Like I said, it's rare. There is usually some level of information security, like access management, that you want to validate. But in this case, independent of any other factor, the mere interaction with your customers should warrant you to validate a vendor's reputation via HR controls. Another key item to look into with vendors directly interacting with your customers is complaint management. You're going to want to know when your clients have issues with the organization or the type of support they're receiving. These types of vendors should have a system in place to track when communication was initiated, when it was responded to, what the request consisted of, and what the resulting discussion has been, and a timeline over which this happened. You should have a service level agreement about how these are both handled and reported. In the instance now before us is looking at the business impact risk or criticality of a vendor. Now this could be done on a few levels. There's the obvious showstoppers that we couldn't function without, like your no-joke critical vendors. There may be some other reasons, though not as severe, where we need to make sure a vendor can keep doing what they're doing because we rely on them in some way, whether it be to maintain our own regulatory compliance, or because they support revenue, or because they're supplementing tasks that we could do internally, but we really don't want to undertake. Of course, before signing on with any relationship like this kind, definitely make sure that the right approvals are in place and that all stakeholders know about it. It's tough to hold vendors accountable if there aren't good SLAs in place, so validate that those are adequate too. On the vendor side, look at their business continuity and disaster recovery information. For business continuity and disaster recovery, I'd want to see summaries of their plans, summaries of their most recent tests, and I would also want to know their RTOs and RPOs. Quick reminder here, an RTO is also called a recovery time objective, and that's essentially how long it will take to recover the organization back to normal operations after a business impacting event. RPOs, recovery point objectives, are essentially how much data could be lost from the point of the business impacting event to recovery to normal operations. Most organizations aren't going to share their full business continuity and disaster recovery plans and associated plans like pandemic plans and emergency preparedness, nor will they likely provide full details on the testing performed. You'll want to at least get a summary of their plans and tests of those plans, especially around areas directly impacting your operations. Especially for any critical vendor, make sure you know who their critical vendors are and follow the line of dependency, so to speak. Make sure that they've validated business continuity in a way that meets your standards. Here, we're encountering the classic question about cost. This is the one that always seems to end up on questionnaires, but typically from an InfoSec or a vendor outreach standpoint. What can you really do to mitigate the added risk of a vendor just being expensive? Now, this isn't an exact science, but generally speaking, the more expensive the services, the more complex those services tend to be. The expense heightens the impact of having to transition away from that service, even if it's not technically critical. These are the relationships you want to make sure you have a good amount of exposure to corporate risk teams or committees or the board, and they should be closely monitored so that the expenditure can be consistently validated and justified. It's good to make sure your finance team or CPA can continue to justify the need as things change. Not to mention, if an organization such as these become more insolvent, there could be a heightened probability of a merger or acquisition, which could significantly impact your organization. Again, it's not a one-for-one that high-ticket services are critical, but it's probably a good idea for all of the reasons we've discussed to treat them similarly.
Our second poll question of the day is, how does your organization conduct vendor due diligence? Based on risk ratings, based on inherent risks, combined or both, or you use different metrics, or you're not sure? And Jill, I have another question here that I think we can go ahead and answer. And that question is, do we need to be answering all inherent risk questions for all of our vendors, or should this be taken on a vendor-by-vendor basis?
Ooh, this is a good one. My answer is it's short, and I believe that all questions should be answered. Now, understand not all inherent risk questions will apply to a particular vendor, but knowing why they do not apply to the vendor is important. Also, note that the due diligence effort is commensurate with the level of risk, so that the higher the inherent risk, the more thorough the due diligence effort should be. Again, due diligence effort is commensurate with the risk, but this is all determined based on the answers to the inherent risk question. So it's really important to understand what applies and then work from there.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jill. And go ahead and get those answers into this poll question, as it will be closing here in just about 30 seconds. If you do have any issues with submitting your poll answer, please send us a message within the Ask Question widget, and we'll be happy to assist with that. Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I would like to quickly direct your attention to the Related Content widget, where you will find our Ways to Improve Vendor Document Collection Efficiency infographic that is available for download. Okay, Jill, let's continue with the presentation.
Here's the last inherent risk we're going to cover specifically today, which has to do with the unescorted physical access to facilities. Personnel having unescorted physical access to your facilities. The topic itself isn't a doozy as far as risk goes, but it's often a doozy because it sometimes breaks the mold of existing due diligence practices. Because personnel can include any role from janitors to executive consultants. I know this is a little less pertinent now in a remote environment that we've been existing in, but that could even be a bigger risk since unescorted access is a factor and there might not be as many bodies present on the premises to motivate accountability. If you don't consider this risk individually, you'll probably be conducting due diligence based on incidental access to information. We can't do a whole information security audit on a network or organization that really doesn't have anything to do with your data from a technical standpoint, so what do? Here's our thought. Make sure you get the right approvals and SLAs in place, then focus on their hiring, vetting, and training process. The best way to mitigate this risk is by making sure the people presenting that risk are thoughtfully selected and adequately trained. You might also want to make sure there is appropriate recourse for personnel if they decide to take advantage of or abuse their professional privileges. How would we do this? Well, make sure you know and understand all the people who would be coming on site to your premises. Make sure they've had an appropriate background screening and that they've received any necessary training, even if you have to provide it yourself. In regard to vendor personnel training, when physical access is involved, it's likely you may need to supplement some of the vendor's training with your own. For example, many organizations have policies around displaying name tags or IDs so other on-site personnel and cameras can identify everyone present. People need to know how to properly go through man traps or door interlocks in data centers or more secure areas. People need to be trained to not be so considerate in certain environments by holding doors open or allowing tailgating, that is, people coming through secure doors when another person's badge is accessed, because it's really important to make sure each person uses their badge to authenticate themselves and their access on the premises. These are, of course, in addition to training that may or may not be applicable to your environment or for the vendor, such as clean desk policies and proper disposal of physical documents. Oh goodness, there's more? Yes, there's additional document collection items you may need to collect. Give me 2 seconds of your time. Just a few other items I wanted to mention just in case we have some payment processors or members of the health industry in the webinar. I'd be remiss if these few items weren't mentioned. The point here is the 3 prior pages listed many relevant documents that you should be collecting or data you should be reviewing depending on the risk of your vendor. I'm simply pointing out here that it may not end there if you are working with a vendor where you might need to take an additional step. If they are handling credit card data, a PCI review is required. A PCI review stands for Payment Card Industry. If you are handling any health information, then a HIPAA compliance determination is required. Any other licensing, such as one that comes to mind is a money transmitter license, that should be considered as well. These are items that we pulled out separately to highlight that there could be and will likely be some additional due diligence required other than the standards we tend to reference routinely. Okay, what happens when you can't obtain something from a vendor? And chances are, and we're realists, chances are very likely you will not get everything you want or ask for from the vendor. It depends on how critical that particular document is and the perception by the vendor. It makes some documents so sensitive it gives away the sausage making, so to speak, and it makes the vendor feel like those documents are highly sensitive. So you might only be able to review the document with the vendor, but not actually get the document. It won't be submitted to you. Whatever the situation, document the effort, document the reason why you didn't get the document. For example, the vendor says they don't have it, or the vendor refuses to provide it. You also may want to escalate to your senior management, or at least make them aware, especially when it's a critical, high-risk vendor. For instance, say the vendor will not provide their penetration test results. That's a pretty important document. So a higher level conversation with your senior management is likely worthy. To avoid this obstacle in the future, you may consider renegotiating the terms of the contract with your existing vendors such that they will be contractually required to provide particular due diligence documentation in the future. For new vendors, make sure a provision in your contract is incorporated such that you avoid this type of issue. Having reviewed what it looks like to either conduct due diligence based on risk rating buckets or individual inherent risks, let's go over some of the main pros and cons to each. It's tough to deny the fact that it's way easier to establish and implement a consistent due diligence outreach process based on risk ratings. If you have a small team or no team, and you don't have a good software to help with organizing all of your data points, it might be the only option you have to keep the ball moving. However, in doing it this way, you're inevitably going to be faced with a little more cleanup on down the road. Vendors will be more apt to push back when your request isn't really applicable to what they're doing for you, or there might be some factors that don't exactly drive a higher risk rating. There are still some things you want to do for a validation. For example, you have a vendor that provides an ancillary service to you that isn't critical, but they do really assist with getting leads or driving revenue in some way. They won't be risky and probably won't drive any significant due diligence since you're not giving them data, but you do really want to make sure in some way they have what it takes to weather a storm. With less analysis on the front end and reliance on buckets, you're just apt to miss something. Now, on the other hand, if you're basing your due diligence requests on individual inherent risks, good on you. You're able to better tailor your request to what the vendor is doing, which always makes people happy and really demonstrates the integrity and maturity of your third-party risk management program. But what I'm sure you probably already know is that this is a tough matrix to implement. And that's what really it is, a matrix. You have the list of inherent risks, then you have to conduct an assessment to see what applies to your vendor. Based on your results, you have to essentially consolidate the lists of due diligence and control areas that apply to those particular inherent risks in order to present a clear request to your vendor. Without software, this is a lot. Even with software, it can be tough to set up at first, especially if the software isn't designed specifically for this process. I can say though, when you've already established which inherent risks specifically need to be mitigated and what factors exactly mitigate those risks, it's a lot easier to quantify and systematically determine your residual risk rating.
Our next poll question is, how often does your organization perform vendor due diligence for moderate risk vendors? Only once as a new vendor at contract signing, quarterly, semi-annually, annually, biannually, or you're not sure. And Jill, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And that question is, What if we can't gather some documentation from vendors?
This is a great, relatable question. For new vendors, make sure that your contracts commit them to provide the due diligence documentation from now in the future. For existing vendors, look at the contract. Assuming you have the customer right to audit provision in the contract, you are entitled to obtain that documentation legally. If the provision is not present in the contract with an existing vendor, then upon renewal, amend that contract to incorporate this provision to avoid future issues like this. In the immediate present, consider if this inability to gather documentation as part of due diligence is an issue of non-compliance and worthy of escalation internally. That means in your organization. Here are 4 alternative approaches for collecting due diligence documentation. First, perform a site visit or interview third-party senior leadership and or their SME or SMEs on the control in question. Second, document the effort that you're undertaking to gather this due diligence documentation. Third, document the business reason for requesting the documentation, why it's important, for instance. And fourth, consult your senior management or the board for your org in order to obtain approval or a waiver, also may be known as a risk acceptance in your organization. Hopefully these 4 approaches help.
And here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question. It's always interesting to see what everyone says. Also, I'd like to mention that you'll find our What to Do with Vendor Due Diligence Information ebook available for download in the Related Content widget. This resource will be helpful to understanding how to interpret and act on due diligence results. Jill, I'll pass it back to you.
Here are 2 slides of takeaways, key takeaways. Due diligence should always be accompanied, at least at first, with ensuring the vendor is in good regulatory standing, has a good reputation, is not on any blacklists, and can perform services needed by the line of business. Evidence you request should be prescriptive to save time and help you acquire what you need. Consider testing results as best evidence. Contract terms are an important third-party risk management factor that should never be overlooked. Example, customer right to audit. Another key takeaway point is to continuously monitor vendors who pose significant risk to your organization. When possible, leverage subscription services to monitor for security and other key risk indicators. Be sure to have fluid lines of communication with various stakeholders throughout the organization, such as enterprise risk management, business continuity, IT and InfoSec, legal, audit, and finance. Remember, there is no single best way to quantify risk. Implement foundational aspects, evaluate the process and its output, and look for improvement opportunities. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. Now I'll pass this back to Abby. Oh shit, I didn't destroy anything with anybody else's. Let's see, I'm gonna go back to key takeaway, 29, so that will be 30 on this one, is that right? No. Key takeaways, where are you? Key takeaways.
On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On February 28th, our Vendor Onboarding, How to Do It Correctly webinar, and on March 7th, our Managing Your Vendor's Performance, Why It Matters, and How to Do It webinar. We hope that you will be able to join us for those sessions as well. A link to register for those sessions is in your copy of today's presentation slides. And let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Jill, the next question I have here is, we are a small organization and don't have a risk assessment or due diligence process. Where should we start?
That's a fantastic question, and I just want to allay anyone's concerns that there's no judgment on the size of your organization and what you do or you do not have. That's what we're here for. So I really want to stress that I appreciate the candor of the question. Basically, what I would say is the first effort should go into creating an inherent risk assessment. Developing a good, strong inherent risk assessment should be the first step. That takes into consideration the vendors that you are working with, that your organization employs, and it assesses many different categories of risk, such as legal risk, financial risk, operational risk, strategic risk, cyber risk, and there's a variety of categories. But that's just to give you an idea of what you're looking for. In structuring an inherent risk assessment, ask many different questions that applies to your vendor portfolio, and it enables you as your organization to risk rate based on the answers to these questions, what the vendor's in products or services, risks where they lie. That's why it's called an inherent risk assessment. And it gives you an opportunity to look at what risks you're working with that particular vendor and the products and services that they provide to your organization, and then work from there. So inherent risk assessment is the most important first step, as well as it drives due diligence. What types of documentation we'll be collecting from the vendor based on those risks that you've identified, and it will then drive the cadence of that due diligence documentation, how rigorous you have to be, as well as how often you have to collect it in different phases. The onboarding phase, of course, is when you're doing your initial due diligence documentation, and the next level would be ongoing monitoring when you're moving into more of a BAU state and you're collecting due diligence based on the risk that is posited by that vendor relationship. Thank you for the question. It's wonderful, and it's pretty important too.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jill. The next question I have here is, which is the best way to conduct vendor due diligence? Based on risk ratings, or based on inherent risks, or a hybrid of both?
Well, piggybacking on the question that was so thoughtfully asked, I would continue the answer based on the fact that inherent risk assessments are the starting point for any strong third-party risk management program to assess risks that your organization is working with. So my response to this question is basically pulling through almost from the first question, saying you're working with inherent risks that you've identified. Inherent risk assessment is driving this process. I would recommend working with inherent risk. That's what you identify. That's what you drill down with your inherent risk. That's what you end up risk rating. That's what you work with. So my recommendation would really be using the inherent risk to start there. Due diligence is a fundamental concept and component of any risk management program, but inherent risk is the platform that I would use to jump off any third-party risk management program.
Perfect. Thanks, Jill. Next question I have here is, can you explain mitigating controls in more detail?
Absolutely. This is a good one. I think that answering this with an analogy or a few kinds of metaphors would help here. Mitigating controls, first and foremost, from a definitional standpoint, they reduce the likelihood, occurrence, or severity and impact of risk. If you think about it, for instance, like a seatbelt to a car or an airbag in a car, you're mitigating risk, you're reducing the risk to the occupants of a car. So if you've got your seatbelt on and you're in a car accident, or if you stop short, or if you're in an accident and your airbag deploys, you're prevented from the extreme side of that impact. It doesn't prevent the accident altogether, of course, but it reduces the amount of injury that you would incur. So that's how I think of mitigating controls. Another example would be, for instance, like an umbrella, where we keep often umbrellas in our desk at work, or we keep it in our car to prevent ourselves from getting soaking and our hair being ruined by an unexpected rainstorm. But it doesn't prevent the rainstorm, it just protects us from the likelihood of something happening that We knew there was a possibility. We just are mitigating the amount of kind of damage that would happen to us. So mitigating controls have to do with lessening the severity of a threat after it occurs. Again, it doesn't prevent the threat from initially happening altogether. But that's a great question, and it's a really important concept to have down.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jill. I think we've got time for another question here. And that question is, what are some good places to look to find out if our vendor is in good regulatory standing or has a good reputation and is not on any blacklist? Would an OFAC check accomplish this?
An OFAC check certainly is a regulatory requirement, and that will prevent an organization from engaging with an entity or an organization or where an organization is based, which is prohibited. And that's something that the government compiles and updates frequently to make sure that an organization is not located in a country, or a particular person isn't interacting with someone in an organization here. These are prohibited entities. And so that's something certainly to scrub, to make sure that you scrub during due diligence. But I also recommend looking at a lot of online resources. There's things like the Better Business Bureau. There's also databases, for instance, with Secretary of State's offices. You can make sure that a vendor is incorporated. It is registered with the Secretary of State. You can look for online resources to see if any litigation is pending, if there's any financial instability, to make sure that they're capitalized correctly, and if you know the leaders of that organization in the C-suite, for instance, you can look up their biographies to see what their backgrounds are, what their credentials are, and it can help you make a more informed decision. Like anything in third-party risk management, in order to mitigate risk, we want to validate the people that we're working with, the entity that we're working with are going to be law-abiding, and we want to make sure that they are who they say they are. That's another validation. So that's how I would recommend going about making sure that the entities that you're working with are legal, they're protected, and that your organization is interacting with and doing business with an entity that's legitimate.
Great. Thanks so much, Jill. Unfortunately, that is all of the time that we have left for questions today. So thank you, Jill, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we did not have time to answer today on the live session, we will address with you offline via email. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. A big thank you to Jill for her time and great content. And ask even more questions inside our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. So post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics such as due diligence to assist you. If you'd like to become a member of the third-party think tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also within that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of Enminder, it has been a pleasure. We thank you and have a great rest of your day. Bye.